Hello everyone, welcome to today's video. So this time we are going to talk about the sixth topic, supplementary topic of the summer medical ethics course that I've been teaching at Juntendo University, and the focus is going to be on extending the human lifespan and whether it's an important goal. As you all know, most humans in high income developed countries have life expectancies these days of around 78 to 86 years. The highest ones are, I think, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Japan, where most people, both men and women, can expect to live around 85, 86, maybe even 87 years on average, which means that there are, of course, a lot of people who would die sooner in their maybe sadly 60s, 70s, early 80s, but there are also going to be a lot of people who are outliers in the other direction and live to the 90s, mid 90s, and even to their 100th year. Actually, a funny story, Japan used to give a kind of pretty expensive memorial plaque to everyone who reached the age of 100, but simply there are so many people now who are over 100 years old that the state stopped doing that because it's too expensive and not that special anymore if someone reaches the age of 100. Um, all right, so there is a lot of hype around living longer. Of course, there's a lot of technological progress, and especially in biochemistry, science has made enormous strides since the 1980s, say in the last 45, 50 years or so, and we know a lot more about genetics, we know a lot more about aging, we know a lot more about the processes that lead to different kinds of diseases and problems, and that make it more likely that humans develop all kinds of health issues. So of course, a lot of people are thinking there must be some way to use this kind of information to influence our genes, our bodies, all the different kinds of control mechanisms that regulate how our bodies are repaired, maintained, right? How new cells are created, old ones are refreshed, rebuilt, repaired, and so on. There must be some way to make the most critical systems, our brains, our hearts, our lungs, our digestive tract, and so on, more resilient. And then we could, in theory, go on and live longer if you could solve problems like these, and maybe problems like, issues with soft tissue that gets worn out and overused. Think about your joints. A lot of older people develop problems in the finger joints or the knee, shoulder, elbow, wrist. If you could figure out these kind of things, people could live longer and nicer lives. Now, why is this not a priority? Well, right, it actually kind of is. There are a lot of extremely rich people, for example, American tech billionaires like Thiel and Sam Altman, right, is the boss of OpenAI, who developed ChatGPT. Thiel is a tycoon who is working extensively with the US military, the Israeli military, police offices, and tracking people, and data harvesting is a pretty bad guy, but hey. Right, Jeff Bezos, the Amazon owner, slaver, but these are not necessarily nice guys. They're very rich and they're very excited about living longer, right? And they have crazy amounts of money, and they do put some into startups and different kinds of medical research that is trying to seriously look at whether human life can be extended. And you know this is an interesting line of research. um, the BBC Science Focus did a good piece on this, and it surveys some of the interesting, crazy things that some of these very rich, not necessarily very smart, but very, very rich people try. And it asks the question, why, don't we put government money into this? Well, there seem to be two reasons. One is none of the things that the ultra wealthy, ultra rich people have tried so far seems to have worked. Two, and this is going to be our main topic today. It's not very important, right? So here's the article. It's by Pijnenburg and Leget. Um, they're they used to work both together at a Dutch university, which has an amazing, fantastic applied ethics department, and I think the Netherlands is probably the best in the world in applied ethics when it comes to tech ethics and ethics of healthcare, and maybe only the UK, the US come close in these fields. And the Italian community is pretty good on these issues. Anyway, their article is titled "Who Wants to Live Forever? 3 Arguments Against Extending the Human Lifespan," right? So they argue that research aimed explicitly at extending the human lifespan is undesirable. We should not really want to do that and spend public money on it, and it's also immoral, right? So it's morally not good. Now, there's an interesting thing here about the methodology of this article. Like often when, not often, but especially in Anglophone philosophy, British, American, affiliated Canadian, Australian, universities, something called analytic philosophy is dominant since the Second World War, and very often the ethics and political philosophy of this school is looking at purely the argument. So it says, look, we're just interested in what's good, and then figuring out how that should be done in the real world, or how real world constraints apply to it, like money, political will, culture. It's not really the job of philosophers, because we don't necessarily have the political knowledge, the cultural knowledge, the economic knowledge, which is often a very good way to work because the quality of the philosophical work can be higher. That's what you're focused on, looking at all the arguments, all the connections between the ideas, all the different positions that logically one can support. But it has the downside that in some cases where the economic political landscape is fairly easy to read and obvious, and it limits what can be achieved in real life, it makes some results uninteresting because they're so theoretical. Now, the Dutch, the Holland researchers, they try to avoid this. If you look at people who work at Nijmegen, Utrecht, Radboud, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, their applied ethics departments are almost always doing interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary work, and actually looking at how what can be achieved, what are important real life constraints. And that's the background to this article as well. So when they say, it's undesirable and immoral, they don't say that in a theoretical sense. They are not saying, oh, if we assume that we have infinite money, or that we have already solved, cancer or global inequality, then we shouldn't do it. Of course we should. We should try to help humans to live longer in that case. But right now we have more urgent problems. And that's what their paper is about. So they distinguish 2 approaches to longevity, extending how long people live on average. And one is slowing the natural aging processes of the body, right? This is what the some of these tech billionaires are trying to fund. And the other would be treating more effectively or preventing the illnesses that come with natural aging. So this is what humanity actually does. B is the second option is what we do, for example, when we do cancer research, right? Cancer is something that people are more likely to get the longer they live. Something goes wrong in our bodies and cancer can spread. Um, and there are a host of other similar things. Heart disease is like that. The heart gets worn out, or you know, uh, people develop problems with their arteries, and due to their diet or lifestyle, or simply some people have um, genetic higher genetic likelihood to develop these kind of problems and so on. This is what we usually focus on. Why? Because at the moment, everyone, if they have good health care and food and normal lifestyle and their environment is not too polluted, has about a similar life expectancy. Of course, if you look at poorer countries, the difference is starkly big between them and higher income countries, but that's not because their bodies of the people are different. That's entirely because of the environment, right? So at some point, most people get these diseases, and these are biggest problems at the moment in high-income developed countries. So we try to solve this. PNL, the two authors, Pijnenburg and Leget, they oppose A because they say A rests on a mistaken assumption that just simply extending one's own life is somehow intrinsically in itself something good, and living is always better than non-existence. They do agree that living is intrinsically good in itself, not for something else, but they argue that this is only true of living within a biologically normal limit, right? So that would be the normal life expectations of healthy adults, right? 75 to 95 years or something like that. And they argue that beyond that, living loses its intrinsic value. They say this about this more later on in their article. The other distinction that they introduce is that if you think about human rights, one important right is, of course, our right to our life and decent health. And the natural average life is what we have a right to. But it's very hard to make sense of the idea that anyone would have a right to an enhanced uh, life length. Why? Because rights are claims we can make against other people, right? If I have a right to something, I can say to others, you should help me get this, or you shouldn't prevent me from getting this. Healthcare is very complex and expensive. We need large communities to have healthcare. Without that, it doesn't work. No one can have healthcare alone, even if they're the smartest, most rugged individualist person in the world. It's a social and essentially socialist enterprise aimed at the public good, and it can only be realized in communities. Now, rights only make sense, of course, in communities as well, not for individuals. That's just a nice fantasy of some crazy libertarians. Um, but enhanced life doesn't. It's very hard to make sense of it in the sense that um, there doesn't really seem to be a definite thing that we could formulate as the object of the right. Because, in theory at least, enhancement could help us to live any length, right? And there could be all kinds of strange and fun sci-fi scenarios. Think about people becoming cyborgs or replacing body parts that don't work with artificial or robotic body parts, and then going on to living long times, right? Um, that because there are no limits on these fantasies, of course, no one can have rights to these kinds of things because they're simply infinitely expensive and require things that are nowhere near in existence, techniques, technologies, resources. Now, what are the three main arguments that the authors make? The first one is about justice, and the idea is that how can we justify extending the lives of those who already have a lot more? Um, we cannot, right? So there's a deep problem and worry here about unfairness, and what the authors note is that if you look at life expectancy in high income countries and you compare it with mid and low income countries, you can see that life expectancy is already much higher in high income countries. The lowest averages are in very, very low income, very poor countries with high rates of AIDS, right? In those countries, the infrastructure is very bad, which means that there are no roads, very few hospitals, very few clinics, very few medical universities, so very few trained nurses and doctors and so on. And because of that, even people die even from simple diseases. People can't get surgeries for heart attacks. People can't be saved when they have a stroke. They can't recover from a bad pneumonia, and so on and so on. They can't receive important diabetes medicine and so on. Right. And even if we look at within high income countries, the life expectancy of wealthy people, which usually is counted as the top 15, 10, 5, or 3% in a country, is significantly higher than the average of the rest. If you consider, for example, in the US or the UK, the top 10% high earners live on average 10 to 15 years longer than the bottom 40% earners. So that's a very big difference. Of course, most of this difference is simply because of better access to healthcare, access to better doctors, access to better advice, access to better education, access to better quality food, more free time, so less stress, and so on. If you're very rich, you don't have to worry about your income, your insurance, your family, your children, and all these worries are lifted. People have worries about their business or their success and so on, but it's a very different thing. It can be stressful, and people experience it as great stress, but it's not the same as worrying about basic needs. So um, basically, it would be very expensive to provide life extension and anti-aging treatment. We would need to do the research, and at the beginning, these kind of things are always costly. And we have a lot of people who live in circumstances where we don't even reach the normal, natural average lifespan, right? So there are a lot of people in some of the poorest countries who have life expectancies of 40, 50, 60 years, and part of it is that a lot of children die from very simple, preventable diseases, and the other part is high AIDS rates and bad treatment option, poor treatment options, and so on. So these are the issues that we should probably fix first, right? It's really unfair. There's no good reason beyond pure luck, and that's not a very good reason. There's no reason why anyone today should not have at least 60, 70, 80 years life expectancy. You have some countries where, due to culture and the way communities use their freedom, we see a little bit lower life expectancy. My home country, Hungary, is one such country where people simply eat a lot of quite high cholesterol and fatty food and drink a lot, and still quite a few people smoke, and those things all lower your lifestyle. But Hungary does have decent healthcare and a good ratio of doctors, physicians to population. The problem here really is more about lifestyle choices that people don't want to give up, and that's a separate issue, right? I mean, it's not even necessarily a problem. One could say if people freely, voluntarily choose lifestyles that shave off a few years from their lives. So it's not like, heavy drug addict or heavy alcoholic. A few years you lose, but not too much. For a lifestyle that you prefer, it's very similar to people who enjoy maybe riskier sports or hobbies, and sometimes they have shorter lives. Now, what could be replied against this argument? Well, three replies are these are not ethical issues, but political, as I said. This is often made by people working in British, American research organizations, universities. I think this is just bad ethics. The authors say this, and they're absolutely right. If you don't consider whether the fundamental social circumstances that frame healthcare are just or not, the differences between how much money countries have, how much people earn, if you're not willing to think about the morality of that, you're simply ignoring a very, very large part of ethics. You're just saying, oh, it's something we can't change, we can't, touch these things, financial things, it's just economics or whatever. Economics is moral. Politics is moral. It's full of ethical issues. There's no clear division. These things are connected. It's the same as saying, oh, this is a mathematical issue, not a physical issue. Mathematics is in all parts of physics, right? It would be silly to make such a division. It's the same with ethics. Ethics is everywhere in economics. If you're not willing to ask these questions, you're just not serious about it. It is a moral and ethical question how rich countries spend their money, and we should exercise big pressure on politicians to spend money in morally just and fair ways. If there are very big differences in how much people can live, that's horribly unjust, and it harms very large numbers of people very seriously, and something should be done about it. Some consequentialists reply that just because we cannot help everyone, it doesn't mean we shouldn't help those who can pay for the longer lives. It's not unjust to do so, as long as this does not actively make those in poorer positions worse off, right? So the idea here is that, look, there are these tech billionaires, and there are thousands of billionaires now in the world, and a lot of people who have hundreds of millions of dollars. Maybe they are going to be the only ones who can afford these technologies or have access to them. But why shouldn't we provide them with it? Why shouldn't the public finance at least some of the research that's only going to benefit these extremely wealthy people? It's not like that really does any harm to poorer people, right? Like people who have a life expectancy of 65, their life expectancy won't get shorter just because some people goes from 85 to 95 or from 95 to, I don't know, 100 or 105. That's a very strange line to take again, and I think this is where the distinction that the authors make between, the right to a certain length of life and a right to enhanced life matters a lot, because we can say that, look, of course the ultra wealthy and in general people in high income countries, the US, European countries, Japan, Singapore, Australia, whatever, South Korea, of course they have a right to normal life. They should live as long as normally it's possible for humans to live. Do they have any right that the community should help them to live even longer? Not really. Not really. It just doesn't really make sense to talk about such a right. And, spending more without considering spending on increasing the length of life for those who have much shorter life, that still needs to be justified. Okay, so in healthcare, resources are always limited. There's never enough money for everything. It's the same in research, and in the last 40, 50 years, sadly, the trend is that there's less funding going to education and healthcare and public housing, and more funding and tax breaks and things like that going to businesses. A lot of businesses are allowed to basically pay a lot less in taxes than what they should. And it's very hard to then, say that, well, we have a little money, we don't even have enough money to really research all the important diseases, and we should use some of this to help people who already have some of the highest life expectancies to live even longer. That just sounds silly, right? How could you say that that's more important than helping people to get to the 60, 70, 80 years? That's normal in most high income places. Um, and there can be some assumption that if you're very wealthy, you don't have, because you're going to pay for things yourself, you don't have a duty to others. But that's also irrelevant. It's a silly idea, because wealth can only exist in a society. Everyone who became very rich could only become very rich because they live and work in a country where they can rely on well-trained workforce, who have been, that training has been paid for by society, by parents, by friends, by families, by taxes, through governments. Um, it's the work of many, many public servants and teachers, and people have a good health, right? Um, that's because of the healthcare system, there are roads, there's public infrastructure, there's reliable energy systems, there's reliable, good communication systems, safe roads, and so on and so on. Wealth and richness is not an individual achievement. It can only be understood as something that happens and can happen in certain social contexts. This doesn't mean that people who become wealthy don't work hard or shouldn't be, if they are ethical and moral and gain their wealth in just ways, they shouldn't be praised for, creating successful businesses. They should, of course, as long as they're moral, right? But their contribution is just one element in a large network of contributions. For this reason, there's no such thing as an individual's right that can be made sense of as separate from the social context, and especially in these days from the global context. And the other problem here would be that equity and integrity would be ignored. So um, some people were like, oh, well, but why don't we ask people? Let's make some surveys. Would you support it? And so you can ask that, and almost everyone, if they imagine, oh, maybe I could live 10 years longer, my kids could live 10 years longer, say, yeah, sure, that's amazing. It sounds fantastic. But then if you frame the question in a different way, we ask people everywhere in the world, in the poorest countries as well, do you think that richest countries should spend some of their public funds on helping people who already have the longest lives to live even longer, or should they spend it to make a global health a bit more robust, solve very solvable big health issues in poorer countries, low income areas? Of course, the majority of the earth will opt for the latter, not the former. No sensible adult who knows that in their country there are massive health problems will say, oh, yeah, right, we are economically connected and these other countries are making a ton of money on us. They should just spend it on making the people with longest lives even live longer. Now, then the next question is, if you remember the beginning, the authors mentioned also that the whole idea that just extending life is like very valuable beyond a certain limit is a bit strange. So this is an issue of quality of life versus quantity of life. I think this is the weakest part of the article, but it's still interesting to think through. So basically, their claim is that there's a dominant liberal ideology, a very individualistic ideology. I mean, this is absolutely true. You look at Japan, Europe, US, at least it's true, where living longer is important because I want it, right? The individual wants it, the single person, and because I can have more of the kind of life I like. And basically, their point is that this is a very one-sided and disfigured view of human lives, because we are normally social beings who can only have good lives in a social context. Without a social aspect, there are no good lives for a healthy human being. And hence, age extension only makes sense if it means extension of life's social aspects too, right? So, what they mean here is kind of that if you don't have a family, if you don't have friends, if you don't have anything or anyone you care about, your charity, your job, the thing you do in your community, then beyond a certain point, your life loses a lot of the good aspects that make it worth living. So, again, if we are thinking about how do we spend our money, it would be better to help people live um, lives where they can realize this social aspect more effectively, right? So, um, some people are addicted or due to psychological problems, they don't have good social networks or bad fortune, right? Their family dies in an accident, or someone's someone loses their partner, or their parents very early to illness. We should help these people reconnect and have meaningful good lives in society. Maybe they only live then 75, 80, 85 years, but those were very meaningful, well spent years. In itself, the abstract goals of extending people's life to 100, 110, 120 years, there's a lot of other people are dying and you know can't live even average length lives, is pretty horrible scenario. Now you could argue that, well, yeah, but of course the ultra rich, or people in wealthy countries which would have this kind of longevity treatment, their families would get the treatments, right? So they could, and their friends would get it. So they would live meaningful social lives. But then again, the problem of fairness comes up. Um, why do we choose to help those who already have the most over those who don't? There's just usually no good reason for that kind of decision. Traditional understandings. Now, this is again a part that it's very debatable. This is what the authors mention, that if you look at what most communities have held important and do hold important, both religious and non-religious views of life, views of the good life, emphasize that the most important thing is usually to care for others and to have communal roles, communal duties, right? Do something with other people, and all these views of the good life revolve around social roles and obligations. Even people who would say they live their lives mainly online, or they wouldn't mind being uploaded into a robot or AI, usually imagine that, yeah, but I would chat with people online, play with people online, and so on and so on, interact with people online, or help maintain the kind of, I don't know, Discord server or whatever you do online, practice your hobby online. And the idea of being truly alone is going to be a very different experience. It's a possible experience, but it's a lot more like the experience of the heavy addict, the heavy drug addict, the heavy alcoholic, who can see life as kind of a game where alcohol or drugs are the rewards and everything else is kind of just a problem: your family, your job, society, where you just have to solve the tasks to get to the point where you can enjoy what you really want, the drugs or the alcohol, right? People who are heavy addicts do experience life in that way, but that's a very diminished experience of life. And right, all secular and views and traditions stress the importance of having strong social bonds. Secular means non-religious, and there's a lot of research in psychology that shows that people usually value those times and experiences in life most when they're kind of lost in the experience, right? If you're having a great time with your friends, if you're focusing on some task that you really enjoy, you're building something, making something, painting, crafting, Sometimes it's cleaning, sometimes it's working on an essay, sometimes it's writing, sometimes it's a conversation, sometimes it's whatever. Um, Helps you to get really absorbed in the moment, watching a movie with your loved ones. Those moments are usually what people rate as the best experiences and most outstanding moments of their lives. For me, taking care of my kids can be like playing with my kids can be amazing, right? Being with friends and having a great night can be amazing. Having a great conversation, reading an amazing book can be like that. In those experiences, time becomes a lot less important. Usually, we kind of lose our sense of time, and we are immersed in the moment. It's kind of a timeless experience. When we look at these experiences, we think back later, we often feel, wow, time is kind of flying. I didn't even notice time. I was just having so much fun. It was so intense, so exciting, so interesting. And, you know, we kind of wish that I wish I would have more time. But when we say that, what we're really saying is, I wish I would have more of these kinds of experiences, right? Time in itself, when you were bored, when you had to do a job you didn't like, when you had to attend a lecture that was boring, when you were very tired because you were overworked or stressed, when you were, after a fight or an unpleasant experience. Those Nobody wishes to have more time for that kind of things. It's not time in itself that's so valuable about life. So just extending lifespan isn't going to necessarily increase the quality of the time that you had. So, of course, if most people in most societies would live to about the same age, that would be great because we could expect the people we like to be with, our family, our friends, our social circles, to be around for the same amount of time as well. But if we make society even more unequal in this sense, there will be some people who are around for a very long time, and some people who are around for a really short time. It makes it even more unequal, and it's even harder to have these kind of great social experiences. Right. The last point is a little bit abstract. It's connected to how certain views inspired by libertarian economic ideas look at social good. These are again quite radically individualistic and fairly primitive, rest on some pretty dodgy assumptions about people being very egoistic and strange loners who always try to game life in a sense to win. Um, some of these views were very popular because of the ideological reasons, right? After the World War, there was a great political clash between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and in the U.S., which is and was the dominant country ideologically and research-wise and culture-wise, most of the world since the Second World War, the idea was that everything that's socialistic or society-focused is bad because it's connected to the Soviet Union. This is a very stupid, oversimplifying point of view, of course, but this is how the politicians and the military circles and some of the business circles running that country were looking at things, and they were pushing individualistic ideologies that are very opposed to anything that's a bit left-leaning or socialistic or society-focused or pro-social or communitarian and so on. And sadly, of course, with enormous funding, these views became very widely known and dominant, even though they're not that high quality. These views usually look at the social good as kind of adding up. This is what's good for me as an individual. This is what's good for you. This is what's good for the next person. And we add it up, and that's how we get the social good. This kind of reductivist view of the good in society it leaves out a lot of important things from really understanding what's good for people and how societies work. But even if we accept, okay, let's look at things this way, we have to look at a global community, right? Everyone in the world when we're considering health and age, not just say people in the wealthier parts of Washington and New York, or people in the Netherlands, Germany and Italy, Japan and South Korea and Singapore. Of course, those people live very long lives on average, almost everyone, very healthy lives, but they're not the whole of our global society. They're actually a small part of our global society, right? Europe, the US, and Japan make up only about, what's that? Probably about 10%, 15%, 10, 13% of the global population, something like that, right? 1/10. The rest of the world matters too. It's also humans who feel and experience things the same way, who would like to have meaningful social existences with their friends and family and be happy. So you cannot ignore these things. So even if you take an individualistic methodological approach to counting social good, and that's what we want to increase when we invest public money, merely increasing possible maximum longevity does not do much. We need to help people first in most places to achieve reasonable lengths of life in general in a more equitable, fair manner. Right, that's the paper. I think it's a pretty interesting paper, and of course there are debatable points, so you can think about it, comment on it, and let me know what you think. You don't have to agree with everything in this paper, but I think it definitely merits consideration, and I think the methodological points that individualism is much weaker and much less plausible than it is usually sold as, and the morality of the economic political reality in which we talk about healthcare also matters. It's not just about, oh, if I do A or if I do B, which one has the best outcome. It's also like, why do I only have options A and B? Or why do people in another country don't have options A and B? Those are also important questions. Why do people in other countries have much lower average life expectancies? That is a moral issue as well, and it's something, if we take morality seriously, we have to work on. So if the billionaires would put their money anywhere, it should be that. Some of them have done a lot for this, actually. If you look at the Gates Foundation by Bill Gates, who is the main owner of Microsoft, he and his former wife, they have done a lot of work with the Malaria Foundation to help develop malaria medicine and malaria net kits for people in low-income countries, and that has saved millions and millions of lives. Of course, it's a bit controversial because they're using the same foundation to hide a lot of their money from taxation, right? Because if it's a charity or a foundation, then they pay lower taxes on what they have, but that's a different issue. It's also a moral issue. It's for another occasion. Right. So, some people do put money in good places, and let's hope we see more of that kind of good moral use of the funds of the billionaires, the ultra wealthy, rather than trying to make sure that a few tens of thousands of people can live extremely long lives while everyone else is left behind. Thank you for your attention. I hope this was interesting, and for those of you watching this video for my courses, there will be an online assignment connected to it. For everyone else, you are more than welcome to comment and engage and ask questions, and thank you for your attention. Have a great day. Bye bye.